the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
This is Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my co-director at the Marion E. Wade Center, David Downing, and our podcast producer, Aaron Hill, to have a conversation with an amazing human being.
Oh, my goodness.
It's true.
No pressure.
We are joined by Laura Schmidt, who is not only the archivist at the Wade and knows more about our holdings probably than any other human being. In fact, those of you listeners who, if you want to come and do research to write an article or a book about any of our 7 authors, you'll be working with her and she'll help you find the manuscripts you need. But in addition to that, Laura Schmidt is a Tolkien specialist. And we've asked her to join us tonight to talk about the Silmarillion. What is advantageous about Laura's knowledge is not only is she aware of all the scholarship that has been done on Tolkien, but she's also in touch with all the fan discourse about Tolkien. And there's not many people who know both sides of Tolkien. So we wanted to get her take on the Silmarillion. But first, thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's always great to be here.
Let's just begin with the basics. What does the title Silmarillion refer to? And am I pronouncing it correctly?
My pronunciation's far from perfect in all regards as well. I'll say that at the outset, but I believe Silmarillion is correct.
Oh, good.
And
I've had students say, I was reading the Smileron, and I go, what is that? I don't, you know that. It's by Tolkien. And no, I don't know that by Tolkien.
There's a lot of different takes on that. Yes.
Yeah.
We are not going to get far without talking about the Silmarils, which are these jewels that are created by the elves in the book, and people fight over them throughout the entire course of the story. And so the Silmarillion is the tale of the Silmarils, or the story of the Silmarils. And the Quenta Silmarillion is the bulk of the book, and that is all about what happens with the Silmarils and the elves that created them and their wars over all of that. So, yeah.
Okay. A lot of people assume that the Silmarillion was written after The Lord of the Rings because they never even heard about it till after either reading the novels, the epic fantasy, or seeing the films. Can you review the composition history and the publishing history of the Silmarillion to give us a proper context for Tolkien's legendarium?
Sure. Tolkien was writing this book basically his whole life, and he did not finish it by the time he died. So his son, Christopher, actually ended up publishing it in 1977. That was 4 years after Tolkien's death, and had to compile all the manuscripts and such. Now, that's not for not trying to get it published. Tolkien did work very hard to try to get it published during his lifetime, but never succeeded in getting that out. So really, we have to go back to probably close to World War I when Tolkien started creating these stories. 1914, he and his very good friends in the TCBS, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, had some serious conversations about what they wanted to do with their lives. And with the prospect of war and not knowing how long they had to live, their art, their writing, wanting to better the world, these were all very important to them, these goals. So Tolkien started, he had been writing poetry, but he was writing serious poetry. He also loved languages. These two things were always big in his life. And then he started, getting into the realm of writing fairy stories in his poetry, kind of fantastical themes. And then he realized that story and language go very naturally together. So this is about 1914, 1915 when all of this stuff is coming together. Plus, he's reading things that are inspiring him. And there's this old Anglo-Saxon poem, Christ One, that has both the name Arendelle and Middle Earth in it. And that captures his imagination. So he starts writing poetry and then later stories that, later come into the Silmarillion legendarium. But he doesn't see it as connected legend or a single mythology until about 1917.
Mm.
He's writing more throughout the war. He gets trench fever. He's in hospitals a lot. And so he uses time while he's recovering there to write more stories. And then this just becomes his mythology. And it's something that he wants to do for his country, for England, is the way he says it, because he knows that with all the different invasions over the course of England's history, they've lost a lot of that past literature. They never will be able to get it back. It's been destroyed. So they don't have their own Kalevala like the Finnish people have. So that's what his goal is from the start with the Silmarillion. And it's just a constant throughout his lifetime. Now, in 1930, he sits down to write a story for his kids. And that just kind of comes into being as well, which we won't get off on that rabbit trail in addition to everything else we're talking about. But that was The Hobbit. Yeah. That's published in 1937. And then his publisher says, hey, what else do you have? We'd love to look at your other work because The Hobbit's very popular. He tries to offer them the Silmarillion. And they say, yeah, I don't know what this is. And it doesn't have any hobbits in it either, so we have a problem here.
So how far along was it at that point in terms of the story? Was it like...
There are so many different drafts of these manuscripts and so many different tales, that consist of all of this. I don't know, all of the different versions and which ones were out, in his mind and had been written down by this point. I
should know if he was like pitching them the outline of the story, if he had some of it written and he had a sample or something.
I think that he sent some kind of a sample.
Okay.
Yeah, right. But I don't know what that was. There are books written about,
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
What he was writing.
I remember they
said
of the Silmarillion, they said, too Celtic and too obscure. It was kind of their quick take on the Silmarillion.
Definitely no hobbits. Which is what everyone wanted.
Right. Yes. And not much humor either. They're pretty serious. They're solemn compared to...
Pretty depressing stuff, actually, throughout the book. Not a lot of happy endings. We have
Do you think it's depressing because he conceptualized it during World War I?
Possibly. I mean, I'm not sure why he wrote the stories he did, other than that was the tale he wanted to tell. And the theme of death is very prevalent throughout both the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings. But you have the culmination of this whole legendarium in the Lord of the Rings that gets you the eucatastrophe. It makes it even happier, than you would think after this long journey that the hobbits have. When you learn about the hundreds and thousands of years, leading up to this point, then it's even happier knowing how hard it is to get that kind of a victory in Middle Earth. So
why don't you explain that word eucatastrophe? Because not everyone may be familiar with it.
Sure. And I know we haven't finished the publishing history. We haven't gotten to Lord of the Rings yet.
Yeah,
so we'll need to come back to that. So eucatastrophe is a happy catastrophe. So it's a turning of events at the darkest moment when you think you cannot have a happy ending, and then somehow grace enters into the story, and you get a happy ending. You get this catastrophe that is a happy thing, in the midst of a depressing moment.
He coined that word from Greek. EU is good, like euphoria, good feeling.
Oh, really? He
euthanasia.
Came up with that? Of course he came up
didn't
with
he?
that.
Didn't he coin the word eucatastrophe?
I think he did. I always look this up and then I forget.
Yeah,
we can give him credit for coining that one word.
Well, the word strophe goes back to ancient Greek or classical Greek theater. It would describe the chorus on stage. And so strophe just means turn. So in the text, it would say turn, and the chorus would turn in the opposite direction. So a catastrophe then is a downturn. So eucatastrophe then is a happy as eulogy is supposed to be a happy word at a funeral. So eucatastrophe, same thing, where something you would associate being negative actually has happy implications.
Can you do cat for us? We've got strophe and you. I didn't get the middle part.
Anyway, go back to now the history of Silmarillion.
Sure. So we're in around 1938, Tolkien sitting down to figure out what he wants to write next to help make his publisher happy. And he says, what more can hobbits do? He thinks Bilbo has done everything that hobbits can do. So he starts off from scratch writing this story. It's called The New Hobbit, and he just discovers it as he goes. So I know, David, you've probably talked about this on the podcast already. Right. We have Bingo Bulger Baggins, we have Trotter, we have, all of these characters that never see the light of day, but it takes him years to get The Lord of the Rings into manuscript form. He finishes writing it about 1949, and then he says, hey, I want to get this published, but I also want to publish the Silmarillion. And he writes this because his own publisher, George Allen and Unwin, say, we can't do this. Okay, wartime rationing. We're already publishing a close to 1,000-page book when there's a paper shortage going on in a genre that no one knows what to do with, because sci-fi and fantasy basically came to life during this time period because Tolkien helped invent it. So it was a big risk to even do Lord of the Rings. To ask for 2 books, was a lot to ask. So he tries to shop it around, and he writes like a 40-page letter to this other gentleman named Milton Waldman, and basically lays out the reasoning for why he thinks the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings need to be published together. And this is actually included in a lot of copies of the Silmarillion because it's straight from the horse's mouth. This is Tolkien saying why the Silmarillion is important and how it connects to the Lord of the Rings and the history of Middle-earth. So it's well worth reading, but we didn't get them published together. No one was willing to take that risk at that time. So The Lord of the Rings is published. Fellowship and Two Towers come out in 1954. Return of the King comes out in 1955. And then the Silmarillion, Tolkien works so hard on it, but he never ends up getting it published during his lifetime. And fun Wade factoid, Dr. Kilby, our founder, went over one summer in the 60s to Oxford and actually helped Tolkien work on the manuscripts of the Silmarillion. So he was one of the first people to see this content and wrote a book about it called Tolkien and the Silmarillion. So it's a really fun read to just kind of see what it was like at that time to be with Tolkien and to be part of that creative process.
I think he may have decided, I think we need to wait till Tolkien dies before we put all this together. Let me hand this over to Christopher.
It also feels like, even if somebody would have taken a risk, that it may not have been successful when it initially came out if people weren't so in love with and attached to Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit,
Right.
I think its time is now. People know so much more about the world of Middle-earth. We needed several decades to catch up to understand what this was. And now it's really being mined deeply by a lot of people. Just fans, not just the scholars are really into this work now. So I think its time has come at last.
And you said before that in many ways the Silmarillion is sort of the Old Testament to the Lord of the Rings is the New Testament. It's all these background stories from the First and Second Age, which keep getting alluded and referenced in Lord of the Rings. And you go, what is that about? Why is there a big battle where they found the Barrow Wights? They find all, and you have to go back to the Silmarillion and other sources to find all this historic backstory that only comes clear once you dive into the Silmarillion.
For sure. There's a lot of references in Lord of the Rings and some even in The Hobbit to the Silmarillion. So the more you know about that book, the richer the tapestry becomes and the larger, understanding you have of the foundation of all of these stories. It's fantastic.
And aren't there some characters in Lord of the Rings that have precedence in the Silmarillion? Like, aren't Melkor and Ungoliant predecessors to Sauron and Shelob?
Well, yes, in a way, but Sauron's actually in the Silmarillion and does quite a lot of awful things there too. He gets around.
Okay.
And we have some characters that are in both, like Galadriel and Gandalf and Elrond. They're all in the Silmarillion and learn about their origins, which is fascinating. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But David, you mentioned something about the Old Testament versus New Testament. I think the Silmarillion is closer to the Bible of Tolkien's work because you have everything from the creation to kind of the end of the Third Age, which is where the Lord of the Rings ends off and everything in between. And it lays out these thousands of years of history. And, this is from the Elvish perspective. That's another really important thing to note about the book. It's not the Hobbit perspective. It's not the man perspective. It's the elf perspective. And so these stories are all from that viewpoint and focus on their history. Whereas you would argue Lord of the Rings is more of a Hobbit perspective. They're the protagonists. They're the main characters. We're all figuring out the world through their eyes, especially in the beginning of the work. So the Silmarillion does have a different viewpoint in that way as well. So Melkor, we're going to have to get into the theology a little bit here of the world. We have a one god figure named Eru or Iluvatar, and because it's Tolkien, every character has about 10 names, which is fine.
So it's Eru or Iluvatar? It's not Eru Iluvatar? Because I hear people say that a lot.
I think you can combine them.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Yeah, but you can call him either Eru or Iluvatar.
So that would be like in the Old Testament, sometimes they say Elohim and sometimes they say Yahweh. Is it similar to that?
I mean, I'm sure that linguists could tell us the meaning of both names and all of that. I am not a linguist, but both are legit for the God character in this case. Yeah.
Eru means the one, and Iluvatar means the All-Father.
There you go.
But Tolkien is a linguist. This often happens. You have several, when they're trying to figure out the meaning of a word, they say this might be from the Akkadian or it might be from Hebrew, and they're having to guess what
You're talking
root
about
word.
the Bible now.
Yeah, I'm talking about biblical linguistics. But when you look at Tolkien's own linguistic work, he wrote a really dense scholarly essay called Sigawaraland about the Anglo-Saxon word for Ethiopians. And he says it might be from this root in Teutonic, or it might be from this root in Icelandic. And he actually recreates that in his own works, that names sometimes, there's a certain amount of guesswork trying to figure out what those names mean.
Interesting.
For anybody curious about the etymology, I really recommend the website Tolkien Gateway, because they actually have etymology as a part of each article that you can just click into and then see what the origins of these names are. So that's what I typically
when we were reading through Lord of the Rings, I would look up stuff and it would take me to that website for etymology of words. So
I'm going to be recommending sources. That's what I do as an archivist. Apologies in advance.
Oh, this is helpful.
Yeah. So you were saying about Eru Iluvatar. We cut you off right at the beginning.
That's totally fine. That is
our time is up.
That's what Tolkien is he's rabbit trails, and you just have to accept that. So we have the God figure, and then we have several different lower created beings. If you want to think of them as angels or almost like the Greek pantheon, that's a fine way to think about it. So you have the Ainur, which are these characters that help Iluvatar in the act of creation, which I think we'll maybe get to a bit later. Those that decide to go and take up residence in the created world are called Valar. And there are kind of sub-angels beneath them that you call Mayar. And you can think of them as different power levels, but there's a wide variety of power within each of those different categories. And so they might be closer than you think. That's not necessarily saying that everybody's in this power level has the same amount of power. So all that to say, Melkor is the Satan character in this story, if you're familiar with the Christian story. Yeah. And so he, during the act of creation, causes trouble and wants to have his own kind of theme going on during the act of creation, because the whole earth is created through song. Yeah. So you have this harmony and this unification that the other Valar and Ainur are participating in. And then you've got this one dissonant, character who's doing rock when they're trying to play classical music in the corner. And in an act of pride, that's Melkor saying, I want this for myself, or I want to be known for my own powers and abilities. So Melkor, whose other name is Morgoth, he gets named by one of the elves Morgoth in the story, is the Satan character. And then his sub-lieutenant, who is a Maiar, or a Maya spirit, is Sauron.
Oh, okay.
So that's the way to think of those. And we all know Sauron does make it out of the Silmarillion, or make it out of the first and second ages into the Lord of the Rings, where he is the big baddie at that point. And Melkor is no longer on the stage, but his traces are there for sure. And Ungoliant is probably also a Maya, and actually a very strong one. She might have been a Vala. I'm not entirely certain about that. That's something I would have to look up. But her origin's not fully known. But she actually challenges Melkor to the point where he gets scared for his life. Oh, wow. So that's a bad spider. And she causes great destruction, in the kind of Edenic area of Valinor. She destroys these sources of light called the Two Trees, and then they hightail it over to Middle-earth. And then she almost kills Melkor, but some Balrogs and some other bad folks that are still over there come over and rescue him. But Ungoliant is in the shape of a spider, and she actually is the mother of Shelob.
Oh, okay.
So despite the fact they're how many hundreds of years apart, Shelob is a direct descendant of hers, as are the spiders in Mirkwood as well.
She eats light. That's part of what she does.
She's kind of gluttony personified, because there's a rumor that she ate and ate and ate, and in the end she was not satisfied, and so she consumes herself.
Oh, wow.
I've met that person. I know what if the hobbits had been better etymologists, I'm going to keep going down that rabbit trail. When you get to Cirith Ungol, which is where Shelob is, Cirith means cleft, and Ungol is from Ungoliant. So it's like the cleft of the spider. So somebody should have read the Silmarillion, and they would have said, we're not going up that staircase. We're not, forget it now.
They needed to study their own mythology.
They did. Yeah. Tell us a little about this creation scene. First of all, it's hard to spell and it's hard to pronounce, but it's a beautiful scene. It's much more overtly theological than anything you find in The Lord of the Rings, this opening story in the Silmarillion.
It's the Ainu Lindelay, and it's about the Ainur singing the world into existence. And they have a theme from Ilúvatar, so he kind of sets the stage for them, and then they come together and in harmony to sing this all into being. And they can't see it yet, so when they finally do see it revealed, they know that it is of their song and that they joined in helping create this world. So it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite parts of the Silmarillion by far. And I loved it when I discovered that string theory talks about, these little vibrating strands that all have a certain tone or a musical pitch. I'm like, maybe it did get created through song. And then we have Aslan singing Narnia into existence. So there's a common theme going on there. It's beautiful across these different creative stories. There's also this
theological insight that Melkor tries to introduce discord, but Eru can reach a higher harmony through discord. And so he's able to take Melkor's discordant song and find a higher, and I love that theological principle. It's almost like the fortunate fall, that God could even take Adam and Eve's sin and turn it into something that would ultimately be a beautiful story.
Yes, there's a redemptive quality in that, Ilúvatar can take whatever Melkor tries to put into the song and weave it into the song in a way that will be for good in the end. So that is part of the Ainu Lindelay, is his response to Melkor's discord. Is coming in and changing that into the song the way, it should be at the end. Yes.
Well, this is interesting because it shows that the Silmarillion is much more obviously tied to Christian theology than is Lord of the Rings. Many people read Lord of the Rings and are later surprised to discover that Tolkien was a Christian. So, did Tolkien intentionally decide to keep out any references to Christian theology in Lord of the Rings, wanting just to keep that theology of origins to the Silmarillion?
Well, I want to be very, very careful here because, and I think this is in the Milton Waldman letter, where he talks about direct references to religion kind of harm story in ways that he didn't want to have happen. He didn't like the Arthurian tales for this reason, that they bring Christian elements into the story and he thinks it dilutes it somehow. So we want to make sure that we're not saying that this is a Christian theology in the Silmarillion. It is a theology within a sub-created world that has similarities to our own theology, where you can say, and I have to say to, for the audience to understand the purpose of these characters, Melkor is like a Satan character. You can't necessarily say Melkor is Satan.
Represents Satan, right.
And Eru Ilúvatar has many qualities that are similar to our God, but he is not our God in the same way. Despite the fact, and this is where it gets a little tricky, Tolkien will say that these stories are supposed to be a prehistory to our world, but they are not identical in the same ways theologically. So you have to have that push-pull, and Tolkien loves to live in that gray area, which is very frustrating to everybody who wants to put him into a little box and label him and have it be one way or the other. So we don't have organized religion in this world in the same way that you would maybe other fantasy or, whatever stories. But we do have, in the Second Age, we have a temple and practices in that temple going on. That's one of the most overt references to religion we have, but it's a temple to Melkor. So it's an evil temple. But you don't have a lot in the Lord of the Rings that is organized religion, and that's very intentional. But you do need to pay attention to when the Valar come in and when there's references to the West, because that is the proximity to Eru Ilúvatar. They all dwell in the west part of the world in Valinor. So there is one reference, there's a direct reference to the Valar in the Lord of the Rings, which when I realized this made me very excited. After the destruction of the ring, and you have this eagle bearing news that the battle has been conquered, the eagle has been sent from the Lords of the West, which is the Valar. And eagles are actually the servants of one of the head Vala, which is Manwë, who's kind of the right hand of Eru Ilúvatar And so they're always the symbol of grace or direct reference to the Valar and even Eru himself. And there's another, I love all these little things that are like, it just sends shivers down your spine when you realize it. Saruman, when he's killed, his spirit rises out of his body. He looks to the west, and then a west wind comes and blows it away.
Oh, wow.
And he is a fallen Maya, actually. He was sent over with Gandalf and 3 other wizards to defeat Sauron and encourage people to rise up against Sauron, but he did not stay true to his task. And so at his last scene, the West rejects him, which is chilling, especially when you know more about, hey, read the Silmarillion. There's more good revelations in there like that.
Well, we find out in the appendix to Lord of the Rings that Gandalf himself is a Maiar.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've been calling him, what is he exactly? He's a wizard. But we find out he's actually sent to help those who are doing battle with Sauron.
Yes. And his name is Aloran in the Silmarillion. And you learn about him pretty early on, and he's referenced near the end of the book as well.
So when does he become Mithrandir, or is that just
That's
another
the
name
name that he's given. He has several different names, in Middle-earth.
I'm going to keep throwing at etymology. Myth means gray, so Mithrandir means gray pilgrim. But the under armor that Frodo is wearing is called Mithril.
Yeah.
And that means shining gray. So this it's this mineral or this metal.
Yeah.
So once again, it's not accidental that it's called Mithril when he's called Mithrandir. There's an underlying elf. There's 2 we don't want to get into the 2, but there's kind of an elf Latin and then a contemporary Elvish. So you have to decide whether this is coming from Sindarin or Quenya, correct?
Or Quenya, yeah. Quenya is High Elvish, which was spoken out in Valinor, and then Sindarin was spoken back in Middle-earth. So naturally, Tolkien being a philologist, he knows that elves that are in different parts of the world, they're going to have different languages, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Laura said, let's not get into philology, so I keep bringing up philology.
Naturally. It's not my strong suit.
But what that does for me is it makes me all the more amazed at Tolkien.
Yes.
That as a philologist, what we today call a linguist, he was fascinated by the minutiae of etymology. And yet he was able to transcend that minutiae to create these amazing Lord of the Rings stories that have enchanted people of all religions all around the world. I mean, that is stunning.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of linguists I know, frankly, are kind of boring. I shouldn't say that.
Well,
poor linguist.
When there's a change between philologists, they thought of themselves as one of the humanities. They're studying human culture. When it switched to the word linguistics, they started looking at it as a social science. So there may be a reason that you don't respond to linguistics. I told a student something about etymology, and they said, what does this have to do with bugs? Which is entomology. Yeah, so we have to be careful with our vocabulary here.
And I need to qualify what I say because I wrote a whole book on semiotic theory, which is the study of words and signs. So I find it very fascinating as well. But I am interested in it more as the various ways language in use changes and reflects it changing cultural values.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what amazes me about Tolkien is he does the same thing, but creates an entire world, sub-creation, where these things happen.
And he realizes early on that if you have a language, you have to have a people that speak it. Those people have a history, those people have a culture, and that's what spurred his creativity. And, the 2 went together. They just did. And a lot of his academic energy and language, I think, was used for this creativity in writing these stories. And something that we all relate to when we're reading fantasy or fiction is the believability of the languages. I think even if you're not a linguist, you can kind of tell when something hits you wrong or it hasn't been thought through.
Yeah.
Tolkien doesn't have that problem because he knows languages so well. He knows real languages and the origins of real languages so well. His world brings a different level of believability to it that we all can say, hey, this seems realistic. There's a good reason for that.
Okay, that's a great point.
Yeah.
His knowledge of language helped make the Lord of the Rings seems so believable.
Yeah, there's a lot of fake languages in science fiction stuff, and it really stands out. Like you're watching Star Trek, and they use the word krapla for everything in Klingon, and like it means like 15 different things. You're just like, okay, the writers are being lazy.
Kind of boring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I was reading a play about Archimedes, and his wife's name is Deirdre, which is Irish. I go, why would Archimedes have a wife named Deirdre? I wanted to go back to this point on linguistics. There's in a letter somewhere, he says, I found this Finnish English dictionary, and it was like finding a wine cellar that
Fine
people
wine,
hadn't.
yeah.
And that's such an interesting response. Most people would think of that as the driest thing you could possibly pick up. Most fantasy writers, they tend to say, oh, here's a great storyline. I've got to have them speaking a language.
Yeah.
Even Lewis in Out of the Silent Planet, he throws out, a few different words, Handramit and Harassa and all that.
Yeah.
But it's an afterthought. Whereas Tolkien responded to words like Irindil the way Lewis responded to these pictures, these word pictures in his mind. And it's a fascinating process, and it's very unusual. I don't know of many fantasy writers who would start with language and then start building characters and history from out of language rather
There's
than
a
the other way
reason why
around.
he's still king of the genre. Let me just
that's
say
right.
that.
That's right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
How about one of the more famous stories, and it gets mentioned in Lord of the Rings, the story of Beren and Luthien. Why was that so close to Tolkien's heart?
Well, that was one of the earlier stories written. And just to give a quick summary, if you know the story of Aragorn and Arwen, we have a lot of similarities here. We have a mortal man named Beren. He falls in love with an elvish woman named Luthien, who is basically royalty. She's the daughter of King Thingol of Doriath. And Dad's not happy about this. So he sets them out. He
Is
says,
that a quote from Tolkien? Dad's not happy
this
about
is how I summarize this story, which helps people stay with you because, if they're not going to make it through the book, you got to help them out somehow.
Yeah.
So, Dad's not happy about this. So he says, you can marry my daughter if you get a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth. Good luck with that.
Yeah, no kidding.
And this goes into the
That's
theme.
worse than getting the witch's broom, basically.
And remember, these are jewels that were created by the elves. And long story short, Morgoth steals them. There's 3 of them, puts them in his crown, and he's basically in his stronghold, up away north. And now Beren's got to go get a Silmaril from his crown in order to marry Luthien. So Beren agrees to this, and he says, "You're selling your daughter for a small price here," which There's other things that happen in that story later where you realize this was really stupid of Thingol to do this. So many reasons why, both past and present and future reasons why he should not have done this. And his wife, Melian, warns him. She's like, really, this is not the right thing to ask. There's a curse on these jewels as well. And so you've basically just tied all of us to that. Thank you very much. So Beren goes off, and this is something that I don't really care for in the story. He keeps telling Luthien, "I'll handle it. You stay here," and it's like she keeps coming and saving him, like time and time again. So
good for her.
Eventually they make it there. They do cut one from the crown. Beren gets a little greedy at this point because Morgoth's asleep. Luthien has lulled him to sleep. And he says, "Oh, I'm right here. I'll get the other 2 too while I'm at it." And then he wakes up. Morgoth wakes up and he's trying to cut the other ones off. They have to run out the door. They get attacked by this huge wolf named Karkaroth, who bites off Beren's hand while he has the jewel in his hand. And then they make it back to Doriath and say, "Well, I do have a Silmaril in my hand, but my hand's not here right now."
So that foreshadows the biting off of the finger with the ring on it at the end of Lord of the Rings.
I don't know
right?
if it's something you want to say it foreshadows it. There's a similarity there.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't know if we want to make that correlation directly. So they go through many trials, and all of these things to try to be together, basically, and it's forbidden love. And this reflects Tolkien's own romance with his wife, Edith. They were both orphans. They meet at a boarding house where they were both lodging. She's 19, he's 16. They fall in love, and his guardian, and I don't know how much your listeners know about Tolkien's life, but his parents had both passed away, so he was a ward, if you want to call it that, of Father Francis Morgan, who was a Catholic priest. And Father Francis knows that if John Ronald is going to go anywhere in life, he will need to get a scholarship to go to Oxford to have an academic career. That's absolutely essential. He could not afford the university degree otherwise. So he sees Ronald and Edith going to tea shops and, bike rides and all this stuff. And university exams are coming up, entrance exams. He says, you cannot pursue this relationship at this point in time. You need to focus on your studies. And he forbids Ronald from seeing Edith until Ronald is 21 years of age. So Tolkien's not happy about this, but he abides by his guardian's wishes. He cuts off the relationship at that time. He passes the entrance exams on his second attempt. I want to emphasize second attempt. Does get into Oxford. And at midnight on his 21st birthday, he writes to Edith and asks, can we get back together again? She is engaged to someone else. He goes to her, convinces her to cut off that engagement, become Catholic, marry him, and then he is off to war 3 months later in World War I. So, and they get married in March, I think it is 1916. So he's off in June. So they really had to care deeply for one another to go through all of that. And as orphans as well, the concept of family, the concept of having someone, close to you, that you love dearly, that's going to be there to look out for you, all of that. I think that's why this story was so important to him. And there is a direct scene correlation. After they're married, Edith does dance for him in this wood. And that's a direct scene from Beren and Luthien. Beren comes upon Luthien and she's dancing in a wooded glade. So, and of course, most people know this, but I will mention it. Tolkien's own tombstone has the name Beren beneath his name and the name Luthien beneath Edith's name. So if you think that's maybe a stretch to have a direct correlation, that one you really can't argue with. There was a direct correlation between those names and this couple. Yeah.
And when he gave her an engagement ring, there was a finger in it already.
David.
Oh, no, that's not true. I'm sorry, that's not true. But it is so sweet that there's a good book called The Good Marriage, and it says one of the strongest marriages is a rescue marriage, where neither person had a strong family of origin. So they get together and create a new emotional center for the both of them. And I think that fits the Tolkien's marriage. It was a kind of rescue marriage for both of them.
I remember him saying, your mother and I rescued each other, or something akin to that. It really was that kind of a feeling, yeah.
Now, I understand you recently taught an adult Sunday school class on the Silmarillion.
I did, yeah.
And we were just talking about the Christian implications of the story, but you don't want to overdo it. And I perfectly understand the problems with allegorizing Tolkien because he himself took a stand against allegorizing. That's the whole point of subcreation. This is a whole different world that he has created. But in that Sunday school class, since it was part of a church group, were there things that the members of the class picked up on and got really excited about in terms of illuminating issues of Christian faith?
Sure, yeah. Well, one thing I always say is that books can do incredible work on our hearts and souls. And so being aware of that process is key, and letting God speak through that in ways that he desires and intends is key. So that's always an encouragement, both as Wade Center Archivist and as someone teaching at my church, that I say, let the story work on you the way God wants it to, and be sensitive to that, whether it's that conviction, seeing a character who's being prideful or, making a poor decision, that can bring up things in our own lives where you say, that really illuminated something that I needed to think about in my own life, or that it made something more clear, in the context in which I'm living, the people I'm dealing with, or my own decisions. And I think that the Holy Spirit can use that in tremendous ways. So just talking through story for story's sake is fine to do as Christians, and say, this spoke to me. And it's letting the story remain as story, and it's letting the author have their own intention, and it's just taking it and bearing fruit from that. And that's a beautiful thing. So that's one of the areas that, I asked people, what were some of your takeaways at the end of this? And people were forthright about that. Some of the themes that I pointed out they parallel Christian themes in ways. I'll just go ahead and mention some of those. One was the theme of greed and greedy love. And the Silmarils are beautiful jewels. They're holy, but they're lusted after. And they're supposed to burn people's hands when they are not being taken for the right reasons or by the right people. So you have bad characters that steal them that are getting burned, and you have Thingol as an example of someone who sells his daughter for a jewel,
Yeah.
Despite the fact he's quote unquote on the good guy's team. That's a greedy love. That's not loving your daughter well and lusting after a gem. And he ends up getting killed for it later on. Spoiler alert, but that's what happens, and there's this curse laid on it. And oh goodness, I don't know if I want to bring Feanor into the conversation, but Feanor, the elf who created these jewels when Melkor steals them, has a curse that comes out of this oath that he makes, and it involves bringing the name of God into it. All future generations of anybody who's trying to keep the gems from them, they end up killing their own kind in order to steal boats to pursue Melkor. It turns into a horror show because of lusting after these jewels. So that theme is prevalent throughout the book, as well as the theme of sin and the fruits of sin. You will have, and this is how discord happens or starts in Valinor. Melkor starts spreading lies about the elves being held captive by the Valar and not being allowed to go to Middle-earth and have their own power and their own authority and their own kingdoms. These lies begin to fester. They become rumors. They become discontent. They become starting to make weapons. And then eventually they become exile. They actually kill each other and leave Valinor thinking that we're done with the Valar. We're going to go to Middle-earth. We're going to have our own kingdoms. But those started as lies. So you have these bad seeds or these bad fruit essences or trails that come out of all of this. And that's very resonant with Christian theology.
Right.
But it's not the same in the sense that, you're not saying it's sin in the same way, but, it is in that world what causes all of this trouble. Starts with a very small thing. And we all see that happen in our own lives and in culture and society too, especially with the influence of media. One word spoken in a way that is not conducive for other people's good can turn ghastly and have absolute havoc in just a few hours, really, these days. So, and you've got other things too where there's one elf who wants to marry his cousin. And they're like, that's not done. Where did this come from? And they call that bad fruit, from this oath, this curse that the Noldor had. So those were two. Greedy love, bad fruit. Lust for power is another really big one. And you have that with the Lord of the Rings as well, who's offered the ring and lusts after it versus turns it down. And the ring is basically power, who wants power. Thingol is very proud, and his lust for power is his downfall. You have another king, Turgon of Gondolin, who's told you gotta leave, because your kingdom is going to fall basically if you stay here. But he loved his kingdom and loved having that power so much he decides to stay, and his people suffer for it. His kingdom does end up falling, and there's murders and destruction. So lust for power, and the last one is direct connection to the Valar and to Eru and the elves' own kind of spiritual condition. Not only geographically, because they literally leave Valinor, but their response to Eru and the Valar and how much they trust them versus listen to the lies of Melkor that, they don't have your best interest at heart here. And that goes along with Numenor because there again, you have influence of the Valar are not for you, and you should be able to be immortal like they are. Let's go take that ourselves. Versus you have this remnant of people who become rebels. You have the king's men who are, the ones that are rebelling. And then you have the quote unquote rebels who are really the faithful ones to Eru, and to the Valar. And they are the ones who are not taken in by the lies of Melkor and are content with being mortal. So
people
all
who
of
read
those
about
are
the elves in Lord of the Rings, you're used to these serene, almost angelic creatures. Legolas can walk on top of the snow, and he's so light that he doesn't sink into the snow. And you get to Silmarillion, and they're a lot feistier. The elves of the Silmarillion are very different than you're used to in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, they seem kind of above reproach in the Lord of the Rings almost, like sort of beyond temptation or something.
Well, I'll tell you, the first time I read Lord of the Rings, I'm like, why do these people not help out more? Like, they need so much help, and they're not. You know why? When you've read the Silmarillion, they're tired.
Yeah.
They have had hundreds of years of battles and have been wearing themselves thin all this time, and their end is coming. The end of the Third Age is the end of elves in Middle Earth, and then the remnants of them sail back to Valinor, and many of them have left before this time already. So it's a winding down of their time in Middle Earth.
And there's a real lament there. There's a real
yes.
sense of this lingering sadness that
Yes.
their time is gone. It is true, though. You say, we're going to destroy the ring. We're going to take on Sauron. Here we go. Well, here's some clothing and here's some limbus bread.
Right.
Here's a flashlight. Go for it. Good
And
luck.
very much they've been like, we've tried this 10 times before.
Yeah.
Have fun.
In Germany, since World War II, has been the most pacifistic nation on earth. And some of their involvement right now is surprising because they just got exhausted with warfare after World War I and II. And the elves are a little bit that weariness with warfare you can sense in Lord of the Rings.
Can you explain, you mentioned, the Silmarils and then the trees that Ungoliant steals the light from.
Yeah.
Can you mention kind of the through line of that? Because they're in the Lord of the Rings, there's the white tree and it's a descendant of one of these other trees. Can you kind of explain that whole thing with the lights and then
Yeah, there's a couple things going on here. So we don't have a sun and a moon when creation happens. And they realize that they need light over in Middle-earth. So the Valar do a couple of things. They build these huge lamps, on pillars in the north and the south. Those get knocked over very quickly by Melkor. So they're not around for long. But Varda, her other name is Elbereth, who's she's similar to a Marian figure, if you want to call her that, just because of the regard and high respect she gets from the elves. But she is the wife of Manwë, so she's kind of like the queen of the Valar. But she creates stars in the sky, so that those are the first things the elves see when they wake up. And that's why they are so reverent of her. Elbereth Gilthoniel. You hear that all the time.
Yeah.
The name
Star
of
Kindler, right?
Yes. So
and even in Lord of the Rings, they call her name in times of trouble.
And Sam uses it and gets past the Watchers, and all.
Right.
So yeah, and the more
she creates the stars because the lamps have been knocked down.
I can't remember if it's the lamps are created and then the stars are made or what. Believe me, I've just read this twice within the past 3 months, and I still can't remember the exact timeline.
Okay.
But yes, both coexist at some point, and one of them happens before the other one. I don't remember which one. So when they're back in Valinor, they make new light sources called the two trees. There's the golden one, Laurelin, and then the silver one, Telperion. And they wax and wane, kind of like the sun and the moon. They have a commingling twice a day, and they're beautiful. Melkor and Ungoliant team up. They destroy the trees. And, I should back up here. Before the trees are destroyed, Feanor, who's one of the most talented craftsmen in the Noldor, which is one group of the elves, takes light from the trees and creates the Silmarils. So that is unsullied light from the two trees in the three gems that everybody's fighting over.
Are the two trees descended from the lamps in any way? Or
No,
the separate
those are
light
separate.
sources? Okay, all right.
Yeah, so Aule, who's another one of the Valar, creates the lamps, and then Yavanna, who's his wife, who's kind of the plant goddess, if you want to think of her that way.
Gotcha.
She creates the trees.
Okay.
So the trees are destroyed. Ungoliant and Melkor run back to Middle-earth with the Silmarils and a bunch of other jewels. And then Melkor gets threatened by Ungoliant. He gets saved. She flees. And at that point, the Valar are back mourning the destruction of the two trees, and they are able to get the trees to produce one last flower and one last fruit. And that becomes our sun and moon.
Oh.
So they get some Mayar spirits who are not easily burned to navigate, these things into the air and take them across the sky. And Earth is flat at this point in time too. So you have the sun and moon literally going under the world and coming back up again each day. And that's when the official, timeline of normal years begins, is when we have the rising of the sun and the moon.
Okay.
What about the dead tree in Lord of the Rings when they come to Gondor?
Yeah.
He notices the tree is dead, and that's an extension of this part of the story?
Yeah, okay. This part I am going to not have perfection on remembering because it's kind of complicated. But there is some kind of a descendant or similar tree to Telperion, the silver tree, that gets given as a gift to the island nation of Numenor. And this is both a connection to the Valar and the West, as well as kind of a symbol of the ruling house of men in Numenor. And the Numenorians are the group of men that remained faithful to the Elves and ultimately to the Valar when all these wars were going on in Middle-earth, because there were men that served Melkor and Sauron as well. So the ones that were not in service to the evil forces are given a gift of this island called Numenor, and they are given this tree that is kind of a symbol of their friendship as well as of the ruling house. Now, when you have the kings, the line of kings continue. They become discontent with mortality. They want to attack Valinor, and this is partly Sauron's doing because he goes over there and starts causing trouble. So they begin to say, you need to cut the tree down because it's a symbol of the West, and we're not about that anymore. So that's a point towards a spiritual condition right there, right? So Isildur, who is one of the faithful, sneaks in at his own risk in disguise and steals a fruit from that tree and is, shot at and wounded and everything, but they couldn't tell who it was. The guards couldn't tell who it was. And he escapes with that fruit. And then they end up cutting the tree down. So that's gone. The fruit is taken to Middle-earth with the Númenóreans fleeing from the destruction of Númenor. And that's what becomes the White Tree of Gondor later. And it's also destroyed once again before we get the White Tree in Lord of the Rings.
So that explains, though, the Dunedain of the north are descended from the humans who took the right side with the Valar and Eru.
Yes.
And
Dunedain,
Gondor is kind of the southern branch of the humans that stayed faithful, correct?
Yes. If you want to figure out how this happened with the North and the South Kingdom, we have Elendil, who is Isildur's father, and Isildur has a brother named Anarion. They flee from Númenor in 9 ships. Some of them get blown north. That's Elendil's group gets blown north, and the rest are blown south because when Númenor goes down, it's like an Atlantis story. It sinks beneath the ocean, and they're lucky to even be afloat on these boats going east to Middle-earth. Wow. They're literally fleeing from their entire nation being destroyed. So Elendil sets up the kingdom of Arnor in the north, and then Isildur and Anarion set up the kingdom of Gondor in the south. And we have the cities of Minas Anor and Minas Ithil, Tower of the Sun and Moon, which the 2 brothers rule. And then they have a central city called Osgiliath that they kind of co-rule together. And Minas Ithil turns into Minas Morgul in Lord of the Rings, which is the city of the Ringwraiths. And Osgiliath is destroyed by this point in time. It's in ruins. And then Minas Anor changes into Minas Tirith by the time of the Lord of the Rings.
And once again, you read the Silmarillion, those 2 great pillars of stone in the Anduin River that they cross going down. That's Elendil and Anarion,
That's
correct?
Isildur and Anarion.
Or Isildur and Anarion.
Yeah.
So you go back and you go, oh, well, that's why these great figures are
and
holding their hands out.
whoever's seen the films, we actually do get a piece of this because Isildur and Anarion were fighting against Sauron, and their dad up in the north decides we got to get a group of men and elves down here to just end this, and that is the Battle of the Last Alliance that we see at the opening of the Lord of the Rings films. So Elendil is killed. His sword is broken by Sauron. That's Narsil, his sword. And that's when Isildur picks up the sword that's broken and cuts the ring off of Sauron's hand, which basically destroys his power, at that point in time. Not him, but most of his power. And that's the sword that is then taken to Rivendell, which is where Isildur's youngest son was, which is why they didn't know about Aragorn, because they didn't know that Isildur had this other son back in Rivendell. And then it's reforged. The sword is reforged later into Andúril, Flame of the West, that Aragorn picks up, and he assumes the role of king in Lord of the Rings.
It is a little bit like the Old Testament and the New Testament, because you're reading in the Gospels, and Jesus says, as Moses held up the serpent in the wilderness, so, and you go back and read the story and suddenly say, oh, well, there's this, really important symbol
and
and
there's
backstory.
Family connections, Jesus is, descended from David and, all these descendant characters and stuff. Yeah.
And Númenorian blood is talked about quite a bit too, as being, more resident in Faramir, maybe than in Boromir. And that's kind of a trait that they're talking about, not just the genealogy of being more faithful or having different kind of a quality of spirit than Denethor and Boromir do.
Yeah. I wanted to throw in another etymological fact, which was Orn means tree. So you're reading along and they call Treebeard Fangorn, which means literally beard tree. But Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, means silver tree. And when it gets to Lothlorien, they have these trees called the Malorn, which means golden tree. Oh. So he's not just pulling these things out of his hat. He's literally, you can find out that that's etymologically, that root always means tree at the end of a word in Middle Earth. So I love discovering those kinds of secret little, like Easter eggs. You're reading along and you realize that everything has another level of meaning you didn't realize.
There are people who study just Tolkien's languages too.
I can see that. I can see how you would do that.
And they're very knowledgeable and very good at it.
Right.
What advice, Laura, would you give to people who are about to read Silmarillion?
Oh my. Be patient with yourself. I think one thing I really recommended was have a good reference source at hand. So I would say Tolkien Gateway is wonderful. There's also an index in the back of the book that can help. It gives some summaries of names and things. But take it at the pace you need. Don't feel like you have to rush through it. When I first read this book, maybe this will be an encouragement to anybody who's struggling. I was a junior in high school and it was very hard for me. I loved Lord of the Rings. I really wanted to get into the Silmarillion. And it took me over a year to get through the book. And even then I felt like I didn't fully understand what was going on. And I had to take notes and there were lots of different characters to keep track of and whatnot. The second time I read it, it was better. The third time, I think it actually passed The Hobbit as my second favorite Tolkien book.
Oh, wow.
And it's because it's a book that is so rich and just continues to give every time you read it. There's a real depth to this. And if you do think of it as kind of the Middle Earth or Arda Bible, there's so many rich stories in there. Maybe just dip into one that interests you. If you're dead set on reading it all the way through and just can't do it, maybe don't put that pressure on yourself. There are other people who might take to this like a fish to water and say, this is wonderful, and read it all the way through. My niece, who's a senior in high school right now, has read it straight through and done fine.
Wow.
Bless her. Maybe because she's been hearing about this stuff since she was little, but I don't know. But she did much better with it in high school than I did. So it depends on the person as well.
Well, it's easier to read in pieces than Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is one continuous story. You have to stay with it. Whereas this is like a collection of stories or annals, and you can kind of pick out one and really dive into it for a while and then go to a different one.
It is. And somebody in my Sunday school class, it was hilarious. Tolkien has this trait where he'll mention people we haven't seen yet and stuff we haven't read about yet as kind of coming attractions. And one of my participants in my Sunday school class was like, it's like this donut that's mentioned that never comes back again. It's like, where did the donut go? And if you've read it before, you're like, yeah, of course, you'd say like, oh yeah, and this happens later and this is that connection. But if you're reading it straight through the first time, you have no idea what he's talking about. So just keep that in mind too. Like, just keep trudging through until stuff starts to make sense again. And if it doesn't, back up and, maybe look through some different reference sources and all of that. But yeah, be good to yourself. Don't judge yourself too harshly while you're reading this.
And once you've mastered the Silmarillion, then you can move on to these other books that have been coming out every few years. The Fall of Gondolin and all the other Tolkien works.
There's stories. The Silmarillion is everything in one pot, but there's these other books that kind of take the same stories but give you more manuscript material or enlarge them in some way, shape, or form. Okay. So we have Children of Húrin, Fall of Gondolin, Unfinished Tales, Beren and Luthien. So if you like the Silmarillion, those are great reads because then it's just more stuff, and plus Christopher had to make choices on which manuscript material he includes in the book. He didn't include everything. So he had to make some narrative choices there. So if you want to see everything, there are other places to do that in these books we just mentioned and in the History of Middle-earth series, which has all of the manuscript material that was not, or was, in the Silmarillion, but everything, the Tolkien wrote too. So.
And the best way to get through them all, I think, would be if you're serving a life sentence and they have a library, you've got a lot of time, just spend several years getting more and more acquainted with that world.
There you go.
But it does circle back. Once again, I mentioned the scene where they get captured by the Barrow-wight. And one of the hobbits, I can't remember which one, has this dream that he's a dead king.
I think it was Mary.
Yeah, I think it's Mary.
Yeah.
And you don't really find out what that's all about until you go to the Silmarillion and you understand why this is an old battleground and why there's,
in the Dead Marshes as well. I mean, that's from the Battle of the Last Alliance.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating how it all fits together, but it takes a number of readings for all the pieces to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, which is very enjoyable. So I think it does reward rereadings.
Oh, absolutely. And if you want to think of it as kind of like a layered deal,
right?
Your first scoop, you can maybe get the top couple of layers, maybe the chocolate and the caramel. But when you dig deeper, you hit brownie. It's like, wow.
Maybe I should go back a third time because I read it twice, and the second time I read through it, it had been years since I'd read through it, and it felt like reading it for the first time again. I was constantly looking at the index, like, who are these people again?
Oh yeah, and the genealogies are so helpful. There's so many elves that start with F, and you have to say, was this Fingolfin? Was this Finarfin? And when you see the genealogies, it's like, oh, okay, I remember that they were related to this person, and so this was what they were doing and where they were and everything. So that's helpful. Yeah.
Well, the index also gives their beautiful poetic names, something that means star kindler or that means dusk singer. He's wonderful at coming up with these beautiful little mini metaphors, which are the name of a person. So I like reading the index and the glossary just for the names, apart from the storylines.
Weren't you the one who said that the grammar was going to be boring, that grammar book that Tolkien discovered?
Yeah, for
me. Do we need to have a philological confession?
Well, I'm a little bit
David?
like him. Yeah, no, I think Crystal said that. I'm a little bit like him. When I got to the glossary and the index, I had this feeling of a wine cellar, this whole other layer of the translating their names into English. They're almost all these little haiku, some of their names.
If you like reading Tolkien's fiction, it is a joy to get these illuminations through the language.
Right.
It is. It is very fun. Even for people who are not linguists themselves, he helps give that joy to you.
Right. He turns it into poetry, I think. I think he changes it from science into poetry.
Yeah.
That's a good way to end, turning science into poetry.
Well, Laura, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We know this is a difficult text for some readers, but we're so happy to have someone at the Wade Center who's so knowledgeable and so has this teaching ability to help us all go to a deeper level in our understanding and our enjoyment of Tolkien's work. So thanks again for joining us.
My joy to be here. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.